Hello, everyone. My name is Ranjit Bawa. I'm a PhD student at the DWID Forest Sustainability Lab and the Warnell School of Forestry at University of Georgia. Today, I'll be presenting part of my research, which attempts to estimate forest landowner costs associated with promoting water yields downstream. And so the title of the talk today is Estimating Marginal Costs of Additional Water Flow from Forest Lands in Georgia, United States. So we'll begin with a short introduction. Certain silvicultural practices, such as forest thinning, decreased planting densities, and/or prescribed burning practices, may promote water flow and thereby ease water shortages, especially in times of drought. For example, recent studies find forest thinning is gaining in popularity for its capacity to improve water yields for downstream users. And the basic idea is that essentially thinning decreases the density of vegetation, thereby mitigating excessive evapotranspiration, resulting in a greater flow of water to downstream water users. In such cases, the costs of the ecosystem service may be largely borne locally, while the benefits usually tend to be widely dispersed. And so here, I've provided this figure here. It kind of illustrates the basic relationship between the supply and demand of an environmental service from a private forest. And so, although the exact production function for a particular environmental service is often complicated and even unknown, we know it's produced as a function of timber. And if the environmental service were good in a competitive market, the supply and demand curves would meet at this at the red dot given here, and the equilibrium price for such a service would be P, and the equilibrium quantity would be Q. So right at this red dot, this intersection is would be the equilibrium of an environmental service in a competitive market, and up until Q prime, the price of the environmental service in this portion is zero, and the users or the buyers can freely enjoy this service. But for any amount of service that's beyond Q prime, there would be an opportunity cost for the landowners. And so we're interested in what the landowner would accept for supplying this environmental service beyond Q prime. And often a portion of the environmental service may be captured by their providers in the form of an amenity, recreational opportunity, enhanced land productivity, or even bequest value. And so in such cases, the landowner may be willing to produce some amount of environmental service on their own, such that it's some value greater than Q prime, but less than Q. Okay, so for this particular study, we consider two silvicultural practices, planting density and thinning intensity, for a simulated loblolly pine stand located in the southern part of Georgia, United States, so the lower coastal plain. And loblolly pine actually, dominates the landscape of the lower coastal plain, comprising roughly 80% of the seedlings grown and planted each year. Further, these loblolly pine plantations cover about 3 million hectares of forest lands in Georgia, significantly contributing to the local and regional economies. And so we have two objectives here. The first objective is to determine the physical effects via implementation of the silvicultural practices on water yields. So these would be, which you will see in a bit, reduced planting density and increased thinning intensities. And so the second objective is to provide reliable economic estimates of forest landowner costs associated with increasing water yield to downstream users for an additional unit of volume. And the idea is that by calculating changes in net present value for a range of proposed forest thinning, planting density scenarios, we may derive marginal costs incurred by the landowner associated with producing one additional unit of water. And for that, we're going to measure in dollars per kiloliters, US dollars per kiloliters. And these marginal costs are meant to represent the opportunity cost of resources used to provide improved water yield downstream. So in terms of data sources, we downloaded the growth, yield, and carbon balance model for planted loblolly pine from the Carbon Resources Center at University of Florida. This is a model which allows the user to simulate stand dynamics of planted loblolly pine forests under different management scenarios. So it simulates the growth and yield, including the merchantable volume in 3 wood products: saw timber, chip and saw, and pulpwood. And in doing so, it projects trees per acre and quadratic mean diameter, both of which are needed to ultimately project water yields. And so Timber Mart South was sourced for 2019 stumpage prices of saw timber, chip and saw, and pulpwood. And site preparation costs were retrieved from a recent report from Maggard and Barlow, highlighting costs and trends of southern forestry practices. Fertilizer costs are based on a 5-year average of U.S. prices of urea and superphosphate, which is used to determine cost per pound of applied N and P. So this slide presents the different scenarios considered for our analysis. So we have a total of 10 scenarios, each defined by different thinning intensities and planting densities. And we consider two site indices. So we run this same model on 2 different site indices, one 18.3 meters and 21.3 meters. And so the thinning year in the 18.3, in the site index for the 18.3 meters, it occurs at year 14, and in the slightly improved site index of 21.3 meters, it's at year 18. And so the growth and yield model predicts about 63 tons per hectare at the thinning year. And so because the highest planting density leads to production of more biomass, less thinning intensity is needed to achieve the same amount of biomass. And so that's kind of the reason for the gradual increase in thinnings or thinning intensities. And in terms of revenue, it's really just coming from 2 sources. It's thinning income, which is just the thinning volume multiplied by the market price, as well as the final harvest income, which is then just the harvested volume multiplied by the market price. And again, we have the costs, the mechanical site preparation costs, as well as fertilizer costs. Okay, so for the biophysical estimates, we compute the stand density index, and that's computed as a function of trees per hectare and QMD, where QMD stands for quadratic mean diameter. This is then used to compute LAI, or the leaf area index, which is modeled and parameterized after Gonzalez et al. 2012. And finally, LAI, or leaf area index, again, is used to calculate the ratio ET over PPT. So ET just stands for evapotranspiration, and PPT is a precipitation. The full functional form, which is adapted from McLaughlin et al. 2013. And here in this last equation, MAP stands for mean annual precipitation, and W represents the annual water yield per unit area. So in terms of economics, the economic estimates, we begin with NCF, or net cash flow. And so in this first equation here, the sub T's just refer to year, so year T. So NCF is just the net cash flow in year T. P sub T is the price of timber. And then this V sub T and this V sub T, so this V sub T of X and this V sub T of Y, they stand for the volume of timber collected in year T associated with thinning. That's the first term. And then the second term is the volume of timber collected in year T associated with harvest. And then the C sub T of Z just denote costs associated with fertilizer, which we're just denoting by Z. incurred in year T. And so these periodic cash flows then serve as the basis in deriving NPV, or net present value. So net present value is just defined as the present value of net cash flows that occur at different points in time over a rotation interval, and can be expressed as the second equation. And so here in this second equation, R just assumes R is the interest rate, and that assumes a discount rate. We assume a discount rate of 4%, and capital T here is the number of years compounded, in our case, rotation length. So, finally, if we denote the incremental change of switching from a particular scenario, let's say it's a move from scenario 5 to some other scenario J. Remember, 5 is our base case scenario. J would just denote the other scenarios, 1, 2, 3, 4, 6, 7, 8, 9, as we saw in the previous table. And we can derive, the marginal costs. So that's denoted here, C sub 5 J. So for example, that would be defined as the ratio of the change in NPV to the change in water yield between scenarios 5, our base case scenario, and some other scenario J. And so a reduction in NPV would then be interpreted as the marginal cost incurred by the landowner to switch scenarios. Okay, so in terms of results, this first figure here, it shows the relative impact of thinning and planting intensities on total above ground biomass across the various forest management scenarios considered. So panel A depicts biomass growth under a site index of 18.3 meters. Panel B depicts the same for 21.3 meters. And just looking high level, comparing the two panels, one can see that biomass clearly increases with stand age. So as one shifts from scenario 0 upwards to scenario 9, biomass continuously decreases, while the impact of thinning on total forest inventory at the year of thinning becomes more profound. And so, not surprisingly, we observe higher biomass for a given year, and all else equal, assuming a greater site index. And so the figure also reveals a higher optimal rotation age observed with lower planting density. And in the context of site productivity, the optimal rotation age occurs at year 27 on average, assuming a site index of 18.3 meters, and drops slightly to year 25, or 25 years on average, for a site index of 21.3 meters. So this second set of results presents the trade-offs in net present value versus annual water yield. So NPVs across all management scenarios are reported at optimal rotation age. And so the top graph here assumes a site index of 18.3 meters, and the bottom graph assumes a site index of 21.3 meters. And proceeding from the lowest thinning / densest tree spacing regime to one of higher thinning intensity and lighter planting density, a gradual increase in annual water yield is observed. So under 18.3 meter site index, change in total water yield between the two extremes, scenario 0 to scenario 9, of 3.24% is observed. And under improved site productivity, site index 21.3 meters, a slightly greater increase in total water yield between these two scenarios of 3.41% is observed. And in contrast to water yields at site index 18.3 meters, NPV declined as thinning intensities increased and planting densities declined. So NPV is computed at just under $2,460 per hectare in scenario 0, and drops to $2,298 per hectare in scenario 9, a near 6.54% decline in value, or an average drop of around $17.90 per hectare between each scenario. And under the higher 21.3 meter site index, a milder drop of 4.26% in NPV is observed from $3,503 per hectare in scenario 0 to just over $3,350 per hectare in scenario 9, an average drop of $16.60 per hectare between scenarios. Okay, so our third set of results, our main results, present marginal costs in dollars per kiloliters. So the marginal costs associated with changes in management scenario from base or scenario 5 are presented here. And so note the two lines represent the different site indices considered. And both are characterized by an apparent reduction commensurate with increased thinnings and decreased planing densities. You see under site index 18.3 meters, marginal costs range from $1.35 per kiloliter associated with the shift from scenario 5 to scenario 0 to 72 cents per kiloliter associated with the shift from scenario 5 to scenario 9. And so marginal costs under site index 21.3 meters range from $1.20 per kiloliter to 66 cents per kiloliter, assuming those same ranges, so $1.20 per kiloliter from scenario 5 to scenario 0 and 66 cents per kiloliter going from scenario 5 to scenario 9. And the downward sloping marginal cost curve associated with producing an extra unit of water yield would seem to imply additional units of water become less costly to produce as the changes to thinnings and planing densities intensify. And so it should be noted that the economic value in gains in clean water from interventions in forest ecosystems is likely to be highly variable, perhaps depending on the location, stand structure, and particular interventions considered. So the relative disparity between the two measures, estimates of consumer benefits versus estimates of producer opportunity costs, seem to suggest the landowner, after implementing certain forestry practices to promote water flow downstream, may fail to recover their costs. So unless these costs are paid for by some sort of payment for ecosystem services scheme or subsidies through policy interventions, increases in water yields may not be realized. So some key takeaways from this study. We note that silvicultural interventions, i.e. modifications to thinning and planing density practices, are likely to generate enhanced water flow to downstream users. Private landowners may have to be compensated for improved water services induced by select silvicultural operations because such practices may impose costs to landowners. And finally, one should be cognizant of the fact that there are trade-offs in the provision of such ecosystem services, such as timber extraction, water flow, and carbon sequestration, and such trade-offs should be taken into account while managing forests. So again, you know, the economic trade-offs may be further complicated if one considers carbon sequestration in addition to water yields, because thinnings and reductions in planing may also impact carbon sequestration, and therefore it could be argued that reduction in planing and stand density may be compensated by increased growth rates of the remaining trees, but still such silvicultural practices can also reduce the overall leaf area index, thereby reducing carbon sequestration and further increasing the costs of water yields resulting from management operations. And so that concludes my talk for today. I just want to thank everyone for attending my talk, and I'll leave you with my email address here. If anyone has any questions, further questions, please feel free to email me, and I'll leave you with the next slide, which will just kind of give you a brief list of the references used here. And thank you again, everyone. Bye.